All right, everybody. It looks like we are live on the YouTubes. Stelman Smith Jr. here for the Unapologetic Apologist. This episode brought to you by Wolves Doe Apologetics. JMD there sponsors the channel, so I really appreciate that as always. Today I'm going to be talking to my buddy who I debated back on the Gospel Truth a little over a week ago. We're going to get into some of the stuff we talked about. Just real quick, if you are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe, hit notification bells, because subscriptions don't necessarily mean a whole lot. Of course, the best thing you can do for the algorithm is comment. That makes sure that the video gets out there to new people. As always, if you leave a comment and the comment is sufficiently bigoted, hateful, if it commits logical fallacies, then we'll just read it live on air because it'll be indistinguishable from the rest of the content that you're used to seeing here. So with that out of the way, I would like to introduce my guest, Danny from Phil Talk. How are you doing, sir?
I'm just fine. Thanks for having me on, Stelman.
Of course. And I would like to let the viewers know that I linked your YouTube channel down in the description. So I encourage them to go there and subscribe, watch some of the videos, because I've watched some of your videos. I really do enjoy it. I guess the first hard-hitting question I have to ask you is, why Phil Talk when your name's not Phil?
I was thinking the more likely name change would be just from going from Danny to Phil rather than changing the name of the channel. So no, obviously Phil, I like philosophy, so I like to talk about it. I combined the name.
That completely went over my head. I have to admit, I was like, Phil. Like when I first heard of your channel, I was like, is his name Phil? And then I found out it was Danny. I was like, no. So I guess Phil just kind of stuck in my head, and I didn't think too much further about it. All right, great. So I guess before we get into the meat of what we want to talk about, maybe just introduce yourself to people who don't know you.
Okay. So I go by Danny. Like I said earlier, I really like philosophy. I'm in school for it. I'm working on my master's degree. I have a bachelor's in philosophy. I enjoy debating as well, so philosophy is kind of indispensable in that kind of for that kind of purpose. I started with philosophy of religion. I love philosophy of religion. It's very rich, and it's a great way to introduce people to philosophy, because even though a lot of YouTube people, whether that be YouTubers or people that watch YouTube, especially in this sort of community, apologetics, counter-apologetics, the question of God. There's a lot more to philosophy than whether God exists. God is a pretty big question in philosophy. If you look at the two most commonly taken courses in philosophy on the undergraduate level, number one is ethics. Number two is philosophy of religion. And we're bracketing philosophy 1000. Okay. I don't know the statistics for philosophy 1000, but if you look at the more specialized philosophy courses, ethics, what should we do? Is there meaning? Is there purpose in life? Those sorts of questions are kind of asked in ethics. And then philosophy of religion, right? Religion is a huge part of our culture, and an important one, I think. And it's a great way to get folks get acquainted with some of the jargon we use in the technical language and some of the topics that we address in philosophy. So
yeah, I remember at the first semester in college that I took philosophy, I just fell in love with it. And it was like the first class where, and I don't say this out of laziness, but I didn't really have to study. It was just because everything that was taught, it just stuck in my head. Like I just remembered everything. And
it clicked.
It's all the time. Yeah, and it's funny that you say that I took two philosophy classes. One was ethics, and then the other one was just an introduction to philosophy. But of course, they had a big God section, right? They're discussing the arguments, and it was really cool balance too, because the professor who taught the philosophy 101 class, he wasn't a Christian, but he was a theist, and then the one who taught ethics was an atheist, and so that it was just a really good balance, I felt. But yeah. So.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say that philosophy departments, it is true that about 70% of professional philosophers are atheists, but they're usually philosophy departments are far from dogmatic. It's very, very common to have a faculty where you have multiple theists, and it's not a big deal. In fact, it's you take people like Graham Oppie, he's a very famous atheist, professional philosopher. In his book, arguing, I think it's Arguing About Gods or something like that. I have it right here. Arguing About Gods. He writes that he's an atheist, but he doesn't necessarily think theists are irrational. So that's interesting, right? Professional philosophers look at theism and even Christian monotheism as a legitimate view in a department. So I guess I'm just trying to kind of relate to your experience in your philosophy department. Yeah, there was a theist, there was an atheist. Not a really big deal. It doesn't have really an impact in terms of the material. So.
Yeah, it was cool. It was back then. I didn't know really that much about Christian apologetics at all. Like I'd started getting into it, but I just started getting into it. And so I would raise things in the class with my atheist professor, and he just shut me down. It was like, that was a nice way to check my humility there, But so, yes, we're going to be discussing things in our debate, and I would encourage people to go back to it, because obviously I'm not going to recap everything that was said there. I'm going to kind of highlight some what I thought were some key points, and maybe some points I want to make clarification on, and then you and I can go back and forth on those. But just so people know, you are an atheist, but you're also a dualist. In fact, you even debated Tom Jump, who's a physicalist. Was that a modern day debate where that happened?
I think it was on just T Jump's channel. I think Converse Contender kind of posted the debate and on his channel, but
okay,
as far as I know.
Yeah, I wasn't sure, because I remember Converse Contender, and I know sometimes he moderates for modern day debates. So, and then I know sometimes T Jump will mirror those on his channel, and so I did see it on T Jump's channel, but I wasn't sure where the original source was. Do you have it on your channel as well?
Yeah, I just posted it about a few weeks ago. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So people can go back and see that. So that's a pretty huge, I would say, point of agreement for you and I. But I guess just to kind of kick it off, I have a kind of a question about, what was your strategy going in? Because as I went back and looked at it, it seemed to me that a lot of what it was you were prepared to say, grant my argument, but I think we disagreed on kind of a definition of evidence, and then maybe on your definition was to say, even if I grant your argument, it doesn't count as evidence for God. Was that kind of your tact, or was there something else going on there?
Yeah, there are a lot of debates in which Christian apologists bring up the issue of the soul, the issue of the mind, and they are totally right with respect to the problems of naturalizing these entities, right? There's just too difficult to, I think there are good reasons to think otherwise, that it's a wholly different ontological category from like atoms and quarks and leptons and such, right? I think they're pretty good arguments for that. So a lot of atheists, atheism is associated with naturalism in our culture, are then sort of like kind of tend to target those arguments rather than the sort of inference that if, we can grant dualism, well, do we have reason to think that lends credence to God, into God existing? And so, yes, I think even if I was a physicalist, my strategy ought to be the same, right? Okay, I could be wrong about physicalism. Let's just grant that the mind is immaterial, non-physical. Can you direct me towards how you get the inference from to God existing, right? And so that was the sort of the center point, the focal point of our discussion.
Yeah, and so and I don't necessarily want to spend a ton of time on this, although, because it did kind of, in the moment, I was trying to think on my feet. I remember when you challenged me on it, and I was trying to go, do I have the wrong definition of evidence here? Because, and then we got into a little bit of, well, do we know we have minds a priori, or do we only know a poster? I'm going to pronounce that wrong. I can't say the word.
Posterior. Is it posterior and ori? Posterior, ori.
Posterior and ori. There you go. So, and so I did go and look up, and of course there are different definitions of evidence. So, you can go with the Tolman model. I went back and looked at how a couple of different people say it. Nate Salas said, in academics, they usually define evidence this way. Evidence is anything that supports a claim or that increases its warrant. Joe Schmid said that philosophers define evidence this way. Evidence is something that is more expected on a hypothesis. One would have a greater expectation or likelihood of seeing it than on the negation of the hypothesis, or perhaps on a relevant alternative hypothesis. And so I guess that's kind of where I was going. I was saying, okay, look, we look around, we see minds, and you and I agree minds exist, right? That this isn't something that's just reducible, that's just, another way of saying a physical brain. And we see that, and that, to me, would be more expected if theism were true, or at least should give us some warrant to conclude theism is more likely than some sort of naturalism or other non-mind hypothesis. So I guess where would you disagree with that?
Well, a lot of the accounts of evidence that you just gave are I'm quite sympathetic towards. I just like to distinguish between argument and evidence. And I gave an example of mathematical truths. The way that you understand whether x equals 3 given a certain equation is not a matter of evidence. I wouldn't use that term, and the reason why is I take evidence to be a matter of experience, a matter like an a posteriori kind of concept. Now, some people choose not to use the term that way. And I think in the debate I highlighted this, that if you wanted to use the term in a way where evidence is that which supports a conclusion, then all sorts, then argumentation, logic, even other a posteriori data, that sorts of stuff, that all becomes evidence. And I'm fine with using the term that way. I just presumed that we were using evidence in the sense that it generates predictions, right? We're talking about expectations. There's like a question about what that means. But the idea here is I want to distinguish, for instance, what the sciences do and what the philosophers do in terms of how to establish a conclusion. Okay. Philosophers, as you just mentioned, prefer a priori argumentation, right? They analyze the meanings of terms, and so it's all analytic, hence, terms of meaning, right? There's a whole discipline in philosophy, analytic meaning, right? And that's all, in terms of what a term means to you, that's going to be, or what it entails, that's going to be all a priori. What the scientists do in the lab, though, seems like radically different in terms of how they establish their conclusions. They look at observations and they test for things, and then they really like that word evidence. A lot of atheists will come to you and say, well, where's the evidence for God? A lot of them are asking for some kind of observation, right? When you give them, when you throw the Kalam cosmological argument, you might have scientific evidence for why the universe had a beginning, but those philosophical arguments, premises of the Kalam, that's all a priori, and it's just kind of weird to say that that's the same kind of support as a support that you might appeal to, given what Hubble discovered and the redshifts and models that would indicate that the universe had a beginning. So that's just to say I'm willing to use your notion of evidence, and if it's the sort of notion of evidence that involves philosophical argumentation, then yeah, we could steer the conversation that way, right? And so I would be willing to hear out any philosophical argumentation for why minds entail God.
Sure. Yeah, and going off of that, I mean, that's kind of, I want to use evidence in a way. I mean, I feel like sometimes, you point out there's kind of two different ways you can use it. And if you use it exclusively in this kind of scientist observations, generating predictions, to me, that's just too narrow, because then I want to be able to say an argument is evidence, right? I don't want to just say an argument is in some other category, and then, well, I can have arguments for something, but then someone just accused me of not having any evidence for it, and then they can reject that outright. So that's why I'm kind of sympathetic to maybe a broader view of evidence there. And even if we think about science, something like, and correct me if I'm just off base here, but it seems if we're talking about something like evolution, for example, we can make observations and then you can make predictions and say, well, if life evolved gradually this way, then maybe we can observe this, and we'll observe certain gradual changes and minor mutations that we could hypothesize would lead to bigger changes over time. But then if you're talking about something like the origin of life, we don't look around and see the origin of life. I don't know if you could predict where the origin of life might happen apart from a controlled experiment, but it does seem that we're looking at things and then reasoning back to what's the most likely thing to have occurred however long ago. So am I off there?
I mean, in terms of your first point, that you don't want to use a myopic understanding of evidence, too tunneled on one kind of support. I mean, sure, I don't I'm just going to use it the way you do to communicate, right? I just use it differently, and it doesn't really matter that I use it differently. I now, from now on, I understand that you use what you mean evidence. When I hear you use the term, you just mean in support of whatever, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that for the purposes of our conversation. After all, I just take words to be tools to communication. I don't think there's a have you ever been in those debates of whether, like, what a sport is exactly? Whether, let's say, video game competitive video, that's a sport or not. I've heard many of those sort of debates, and to me, they just boil down to terminological disputes about how the term game is being used, and it's just completely. It's a disagreement that philosophers are. I mean, the disinterest is just crazy, right? I mean, we don't care about terminological disputes, right? We care because we want to understand each other. So if you're just using the word in support of, then I understand what you're saying now. I mean, at best I can say, hey, maybe my these instances to differentiate evidence and this other kind of support. But then you could just use the term differently in those cases, and then you wouldn't have a problem, presumably. I don't think there's this kind of using terms consistently in all conversations seems kind of silly to me. The way I mean in colloquially is when I'm talking about theories in science, right? And there's no that's not some kind of equivocation fallacy. It's just two different contexts of how to use the word differently. Now to your latter point, I might have talked too long. The latter point was what was it again? Sorry.
I was kind of just making a distinction between, using evolution as kind of an example and saying in one case you can make future testable predictions, in another case you're kind of reasoning back to what's the best explanation.
Yeah, and actually stuff like that, like the origin of life and evolutionary biology, I think that there might be a loose sense of science in which you could call that science, but I think that given the problem you just outlined, right? In fact, the young earth creationists like to distinguish between science and historical science. Well, I don't really adopt those terms, right? I think there is a difference between science and natural history. Okay. And that's maybe taking a very strict notion of what science is, but the idea is this, right? A lump of gold, like maybe the largest lump of gold in the earth might have a diameter of 2 feet, let's just say. Okay. The thing is that that's not physically necessary, right? That's just kind of an accident. There are no laws of nature that dictate the diameter of a lump of gold. You can have a huge lump of gold. You have a small lump of gold occur naturally. Either one is fine. Maybe a better example would be the height of Mount Everest, right? There are no laws of Mount Everestist, right? Or no laws of nature that dictates or necessitates Mount Everest being the height that it is. It could have been a different height, and the laws of physics would have been the same. Okay. Now, a lump of uranium, for instance, to have a diameter of 1 mile. That's physically impossible. Okay, and you can appeal to laws of physics for that, given the protons and the neutrons and the way that they interact, their behavior, and you can reduce everything to why a lump of uranium having a diameter of 1 mile is impossible. That's not the case for gold. So, if we find gold with a particular diameter, this is just to say that there's not going to be a unified theory about what explains that. There's not going to be a scientific theory that explains why all these nuggets of gold have a diameter that they have. Okay, so it's all accidents, in a sense. It's an accident. The height of Mount Everest is an accident. So there's nothing that you can use some kind of law or theory and then generate predictions, right, about what particular amount, what diameters of lumps of gold that you would find on Earth, right? And so I look at the origin of life in this way. I don't think there could be a unified theory of life. So that just puts, in my view, biology and the natural especially evolutionary biology. Maybe biology has its place in science. Stuff like evolutionary biology, ecology, taxonomy, these are in jeopardy of a particular strict notion of science, right? They're in jeopardy of not being under that sort of umbrella. So it's just an accident. There's not going to be like a generalized unified theory that I can make predictions from in terms of where I would expect life. It's just accidents, on my view. Sorry if that was long-winded. You
No,
could, you're
no, it's
free,
okay.
if you could, you're free to interrupt me. I don't mind being
No,
interrupted.
it's fine. No, I wanted you to be able to finish the thought because then we're going to transition to kind of the stuff, the more substantive stuff in the debate, the actual argument for mind. So again, I would recommend people, and you've uploaded it to your channel as well, so people can either go to your channel or the Gospel Truth to view the debate. Because again, I'm going to briefly sketch out what my argument was, and then people are probably going to come up with objections that were answered in maybe the longer 20-minute opening.
Okay.
So just to briefly sketch it out again, I made appeals to what are attributes of mind, just to make the argument that we even have them, which again, you agree with this, but I appeal to qualia, which is the feeling sensations of, certain aspects, like happiness feels a certain way, and itch feels a certain way from the perspective of the direct observer. That's not identical with the brain states that are correlated with an itch or happiness. Because again, the only way neuroscientists were able to map out the connection was to ask the subject how they were feeling. They didn't know just by looking at the brain states. I appeal to direct access, which is that my consciousness is directly knowable by me. And then free will, and I tried to narrow that to kind of the power to choose, because obviously, as you know, there are disputes about free will. Some people say it's an illusion. And I tried to even grant that maybe it is, you could appeal to it being an illusion, but we still have a sense of ourselves making choices. And that's not identical with certain brain states that don't make choices. And then of course,
I think you're saying there, even the notion of an illusion is not going to be so reducible. It's still going to be lumped in the category. Yeah, I agree with you there. Yeah, that was a good point.
I really appreciate that clarification, because that adds to the point. And the thing I could have mentioned is intentionality. Obviously, you've made this argument before that physical states, rocks aren't about anything, right? Like a book would be a perfect example, because people might say, well, a book is about something, but not really, right? Because a book is paper, it's ink blots, they're shaped in certain ways. And the only way you can even speak of the book being about something is as once a mind imposes meaning on it, right? So only minds are kind of about things and have this kind of intentionality to do things. And I use naturalism, although I think the argument would work with any non-mind hypothesis, to say, look, on naturalism, you have a construction problem. You can't build these things. And I know people love to say composition fallacy, right? But I gave very clear examples of certain constructions that are impossible, right? You can't build a blue window out of red bricks. That's an impossible construction. To use Josh Rasmussen's example, you can't build a prime minister out of prime numbers. That's an impossible construction. You can't build a purple floor out of white tiles. That's an impossible construction. And so I made the argument that, when it comes to brains giving rise to consciousness, how can that happen if all you have are third-person properties? How can you give rise to first-person properties of a mind? And I guess before I go into, because obviously we had some disagreements about that. In fact, you said something in your closing speech, which I was like, closing speech. That to me, that was the whole point of contention. But I guess I'll let you comment on that before I go into kind of some of the key disagreements.
About my closing speech? I mean, the idea is that on theism, a lot of versions of theism, God created ex nihilo. And the idea is that what the kind of narrative there is that there are these intentions of God, and that caused matter to kind of come about, right? Now, the idea is that there's an interaction there, and a causal interaction, and the properties of God's intentions are just so radically different, incommensurable with the properties in which and of matter, which was the effect of his intentions. Okay, so that's just to say that you can have a sort of interaction between the mental and the physical, even though the mental and physical possess incommensurable properties, or properties that can't be reduced to one another. Maybe I should hesitate using the word incommensurable. Maybe that's not applicable here. But the idea is that you and I agree that physical properties can't be reduced to mental properties. They can't be identified with. But I just don't think that has an impact on explanation or cause between the two kinds of categories, right? So you want to say that it's impossible on some level that matter could bring about a mind, right? Given that their properties can't be identified with another. They're so radically different. But there's a case right there where God's intentions, who have really these unique properties that you're talking about, led to matter, which has none of those properties. Right. So I just don't see why it couldn't happen in reverse.
Okay, so and this is great because when I read, let me get it out, this book, How Reason Can Lead to God, that was an objection that popped into my mind, right? Because most of my opening speech, people should know, highly recommend this book. Most of my opening speech was taken directly from Josh's chapter in here, Foundation of Mind.
Mm-hmm.
And he makes the case I just made. And then I got to the next chapter called Foundation of Matter. And before I even read it, the thing popped into my mind is like, wait a minute, if we're saying there's a construction problem, how can matter construct mind? There should be a reverse construction problem. How can mind construct matter? And Josh gets into this in his book, and I've talked with Mike Jones a lot about this and studied his stuff. I think that's solved by idealism. Right? Because I think on your point, yeah, I think you do have a problem if you kind of have this foundational mind and then it gives this rise to this radically new substance called matter. To me, that is a problem. And so I don't take that route. I do take the route that what we call matter is an aspect of mind, right? I am a dual aspect idealist. Mm-hmm. But again, the idealist argument is that if I'm describing this mug, color, that's a mental experience. Shape, that's a mental experience. Weight, that's a mental experience. And when you get rid of all the mental experiences, you don't have anything left. So and we have experiences this in our lives, right? If you close your eyes, you can kind of construct maybe blurry, colorful blobs and make them into shapes, then put them together. And so to me, that's a way of saying that would be, and when we do that, that's on a private canvas, right? The private canvas of our minds and our imagination. When God does that, it's on a public canvas, what we call the universe. And so what we call matter is an aspect of mind, but it's not some radically new substance that God has to somehow be connected to.
Yeah, I think that I would anticipate that you're misunderstanding what Dr. Rasmussen's point is. And first of all, I completely agree with him, right? That there is a construction problem here, okay? But I think that the notion of construction that he's talking about relates to reduction. The idea is that he's saying that when you construct a water molecule out of hydrogens and oxygens, right? There's no problem there, right? You put a couple hydrogens and oxygen together, you get new physical properties. Okay, no problem there. But notice that the water is somehow reduced to or identical to the structure that has been put together, the construction,
sure.
H2O. That relation is not causal. Okay. That is not a causal relation. And I'm totally with y'all there, right? That you can't do that with minds to physical states like brain states, neurological states, physiological states. Okay. What I'm saying is that I'm saying that what's possible is a cause-effect relationship, okay, between, let's say, something like water and a mental state. Water can cause mentality, right? But it doesn't. There's no construction relation, right? How I interpret Dr. Rasmussen, right, is that how you say his name? Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Rasmussen, that's how I say it. So if it's wrong, we're both saying it wrong.
Yeah. How I interpret Dr. R is he's arguing against a reductive account of mental states and mind. Okay. Totally agree. But our disagreement is about cause explanation. Okay. It's about what explains why we have mentality in the first place. And I don't think that you could appeal to those arguments that Rasmussen is giving to those construction problems, right? Those are good arguments against the reductionist. Okay. I'm not a reductionist. I'm saying that, look, there's a causal interaction between matter and mind. One can't be reduced to the other. One doesn't construct the other in the sense that we can like make that there's an identity relation of a sort. I'm saying that there's a cause-effect relationship. And I think that's totally possible because if it's possible the mind can cause matter, then I don't see the impossibility of matter causing mind.
Okay, so it's good. This is going to get into some of the heart of our disagreement. So I've spoken to Josh on this, so I do know that his argument does go further than the mere reductionist model because it does speak of emergentism and talks about how there's even a problem on emergentism, right? Because you're still facing some sort of construction. Right. On the one hand, there's a construction that just says, well, we construct this thing and then it's identical to the mind. And on the other hand, there's an argument.
Views are not causal views, right? Frankly, I don't even understand. I'm right with Rasmussen. In the literature, supervenience, emergentist views, right, are not causal. There's not cause effect, right? Some people want to say that water supervenes on H2O, and that's going to be a kind of emergent that could be potentially an emergent view. Okay, I'm right. I don't think mind can do that either, right? So look, here's how I see the dialectic, right? You got people that want to identify them. So you have the hardcore naturalist reductionists, and then you got people like us, right, that want to say, look, these are two different ontological categories. Then you have the people that try to cheat, the non-reductive physicalist, right? They're saying, no, you can't make identity relation, but there's not a cause-effect relation. It's this emergence thing going on, this supervenient dependency relation of a sort that's not cause-effect, but nor is it identity. And I don't know what the heck they're talking about, right?
Well, I was going to ask you, maybe you could clarify then what they're arguing, because how would that not be cause to say a certain brain structure can cause quote-unquote mental experiences that aren't identical with the brain? If that's not what they're arguing, what are they arguing?
Well, traditionally, emergentist views rely mostly on the notion of supervenience. Okay, and supervenience is something like A supervenes on B if and only if there's a change in A, then there's a change in B. Okay. Now, they want to say that that doesn't establish an identity or reductive account of mental to physical. Honestly, it's so cryptic to me. I mean, I bought multiple books on it. I just cannot understand it because, number one, that definition I just gave you, right, where if there's a change in A, there's a change in B, that's consistent with identity, right? Also,
yeah, of course.
That's good. So I don't know what they're trying to distinguish themselves from reductive physicalists and identity theorists, right? I don't know how, given that definition. The second thing, then everything supervenes on itself, right? Look, I'm Danny, and I supervene on Danny because if there's a change in Danny, then there's a change on Danny, right?
Right.
It's a relation that I don't understand, but it's very popular in the literature, very, very popular, because what it tries to do is escape the problems of the reductive account of physicalism. Okay.
So I don't mean to interrupt. This is all this stuff we would agree on, and I think I might have lost track of why this is a disagreement with the argument I was making.
Oh,
so maybe we could go back and say, because I was basically laying out the construction problem. There's a construction problem whether you're talking about reductionism or emergentism.
Yeah, so I see the construction problem, the dependency relation, supervenience, emergentism to be all problems on physicalism. Okay, I don't think this is a problem list. Okay, so when now I have not read that book, and you know more than I do, but I'm just leaning on the little background knowledge I have on the issue. Okay. And in terms of how I'm interpreting Dr. R. Okay, so you might have a better interpretation of him, but if it's anything like the sort of criticisms that I've read about physicalism and this whole dialectic, right? I just take dependency relations, emergentism, supervenience to be all kind of the same view, where like you have this weird relation between A and B. It's not identity, it's not cause effect, and I don't know what the heck they're talking about when they want to do that. It's like they're trying to get, what is the phrase? They're eating their cake and they're getting
having their cake and eat it too.
Yeah, they're doing that. Okay, they're just taking big pieces of the cake, and I don't understand why they're taking these big pieces when they're not licensed to. Okay, you might they want to escape the problems of reductive physicalism without committing themselves to dualism. That's how I look at it. Now that's just a psychological
And so he does criticize a version of dualism, right? And it's a kind of version of dualism that again says we're trying to explain the substance of mind via the substance of matter. And so he does argue that the construction problem applies to that too, right? He says, well, basically there's two kinds of emergentism. One is just identical with reductionism when you actually flesh it out, and then the other one is saying there is this new substance. So then he criticizes them and says, well, hold on, you were trying to argue against the soul, but now you have this other substance you're calling mind. Now, granted, I don't necessarily want to get into the Christian theology, how Mike Jones defines the soul that's not identical with mind. So I wouldn't be clear that I'm not saying that. But again, he does say there's a problem in trying to construct that. Now, I had some things written here, and I apologize if this takes me a minute to read. I know you're going to want to interject with some thoughts.
Okay.
But I feel as though if I just read one point, we could talk about that for an hour. And so I kind of want to get all 3 points out and then let you say, okay, these are the ones I think are worth considering. So I highlighted something that you said in our discussion. And by the way, if I say that you said something and you realize, and that's me misunderstanding it, then please do interrupt by all means.
Okay.
But I did write that you said something that because we know about the brain having causal effects on consciousness, like alcohol use was your example, that therefore there's nothing contradictory about saying the brain causes consciousness, and so we can't rule out the possibility that consciousness can be explained as the result of matter and brain interactions. What I wrote because that struck me as weird during our conversation, I've thought about it since, is, well, I can make a mirror claim, right? Because I think we both agreed that there is mental causation, right, where the causation goes the other way, where the mind can cause brain changes. And so I said, well, if we have this mirror scenario where consciousness is the first mover and causing brain changes, then there's nothing contradictory about saying mind causes brain, or that, as inspiring philosophy, Mike Jones would argue, that brain is emergent of mind. And so we can argue that the brain and body is explained entirely as the result of mind, as I, as an idealist, would. And so I wrote, so we need, and I don't know if I'm using this term right, I wrote symmetry breaker. Is that the correct use of symmetry breaker, to say we kind of have these mirror claims and we need something to say one of them's more likely?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying.
Okay, so I have 3 reasons, and then actually there's a 4th one Josh gave me on the phone the other day. So the first is, we could grant the possibility of mind arising naturally. I don't grant it, right? But I said we could, but point out how unlikely that would be given atheism, right? Because not only do you have to have a universe existing at all, but then you have to have it fine-tuned where life even could exist on one planet. And then even if you have that, you have to have the origin of life. And even after that, you have to have evolution happen properly to where that can be the case. So there's all these hurdles to overcome. Whereas on theism, it's reasonable that God would not only want other minds, but have the resources to produce minds, not only the first person aspects, but also the power and intelligence to create and fine tune the universe for those minds. And I wrote that once we can see that minds exist, that is some reason to believe God would have wanted and intended those minds to exist. Whereas on atheism, there is no such expectation. So that's the first point. And by the way, if you want me to remind you of these points, I'll go back through them. Number 2 is, my argument was that the form of construction was impossible, right? It is impossible to construct a white floor from blue tiles. It is impossible to construct a prime minister from prime numbers. It's impossible to construct a green window from red bricks, right? And so we need some kind of argument for why constructing first-person experiences from third-person material is fundamentally different than those other impossible constructions, right? And I might insert here on point 2, and we can go into this further, that when we talk about the brain having causal effects on consciousness, that actually presupposes the mind is already there, right? And so it seems that even in the case where that's happening, mind is still fundamental. And there's an analogy that we can talk about later. But then number 3, I wrote, going off of point number 2, theism is simpler because it doesn't posit a new substance coming from something that does not already have that substance. And I wrote, in your closing, you brought up a point that properties that exist in the effect don't need to be found in the properties of the cause. And I think there's a one way we can agree on that, right? Where we would say like doesn't produce like, right? So for example, you can imagine if you have a triangular piece of marble, right? And then you smash it into pieces. It's not as though each of those pieces are necessarily going to be triangles, right? They might be all kinds of weird shapes that when you put together, now you get a triangle. But what that would show is that shape isn't something that just by reconstructing doesn't have to infer on the new substance, whereas all of the individual pieces would still be marble. And then when you reconstructed them, they would still be marble. And so there's still certain things we have to recognize that properties do infer on the whole. Shape might not be one of those, but something like, I say, marble would be one of those. And then you gave an example of the match and the paper. Neither contain ash, right? But ash can be the effect. And I said the reason this example doesn't work is for 2 reasons. The first is that all the things in the cause and the effect relationship remain third-person materials, right? So we still have the construction problem when it comes to consciousness. One can never get a new first-person experience by combining a match, fire, and paper. So there's no new substance coming into existence. But also that the ash is a necessary result of the combination of the match, fire, and paper, right? There's kind of laws of physics that dictate the ash is going to be a necessary effect. Whereas I think you even said in the debate that's not the case with brain and mind, because we could conceive of a mind existing in a toy, like in Toy Story. And so on atheism or non-mind hypothesis, one would require a new substance mind to come from third-person materials. And then I wrote the thing I already expressed about idealism, so I don't know if I need to repeat that. So Yeah, I think those three things provide us with a good symmetry break if we're thinking mind is fundamental. But I apologize, I did go on for a while there, and I'm sure
Yeah, that's
I'll
fine.
give you the space to take points as you wish.
We should focus on one point. First of all, this notion of constructing has been used many times, and you need to understand that the way when I hear that term in this context, when you quoted from Dr. R, is that that's tied with reductive identity. If you construct water from hydrogen and oxygen, that implies a reductive account, an identity relation between water and H2O. Okay, I just want to be very clear that I'm totally sympathetic to that being a problem in physicalism, right? I'm just saying that there's not how I see it is that once the identity relation has been made, that's not in terms of the construction relation, that's not a cause effect relation. Okay. It's not like when you put the water molecules together, the hydrogen and oxygen together, that it causes water, right? They want to say that either emergence or there's some kind of identity relation, reductive, whatever, right, between water and H2O. And I'm saying I'm right with y'all that doesn't seem plausible, given the properties of mental states and the properties of physical states. Right there with you. So every time I hear constructing, I hear reductive identity, and I then completely agree with y'all that can't be done. Okay. Also, the notion of explanation. I've been trying to be clear that I take explanation in this context in our debate to be a causal notion. Not all senses of explanation are causal, though. Think about how we use the term when we're doing logic. A is B, B is C, therefore A is C. The premises explain the conclusion, why the conclusion is sort of guaranteed. Okay? But I haven't invoked any notion of cause, right? Sometimes when people want to explain the mind, and then they go to a supervenience relation, they're not using it in a causal sense. Okay?
Sure.
What I took our debate to be was whether God is an explanation for the mind in a causal sense, not in a non-causal sense. Okay, so and that goes to your first point. Yes, I was saying that there's causal interactions between the physical to mental, mental to mental, and mental to physical every day. I also want to. I didn't say this in the debate. I think there are things that cause our mental states external to ourselves that are non-physical. I believe in value properties. Okay. For instance, I think that when you look at a cake and you find it desirable, I think desirability is a property of the cake that's not reducible to the physical facts of the cake, like the amount of icing, the color of the cake, the glucose molecules, whatever, right? None of that is going to explain your desire. It's going to be the value that explains your desire. Okay. So there's an interaction between something that's non-mental, non-physical, right? And mental, which is also non-physical. Okay. So I also have, although I have no idea how it would work, I also think it's possible that something non-physical, that's non-mental, could cause minds. I have no clue what kind of property that would be, but I know that there are non-physical properties external to minds. Okay. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that given the fact that there's interactions between physical to mental, non-mental, non-physical to mental, and then vice versa, plus mental relations, causal relations, right? I think it's perfectly coherent to say that it could be either a physical phenomena that might bring about minds, or a non-physical, non-mental phenomena that might bring about mental states. As in the case of the cake, right? The cake has value properties, it has desirability. I don't understand that as physical, and I also understand that as external from my mind. But that's just to say that we can agree on the coherency of it. Now, if you want to say that God is the best explanation, we have to be careful that it's not ad hoc. Okay, so when you say that it's ad hoc, if I were to charge you with an ad hoc explanation, that sort of, I usually imply that the explanation is perfectly coherent, right? The idea is that if I blame someone ad hocly for why some of my possessions were stolen, right? I have no independent justification for why they stole it, right? It's ad hoc, right, in a sense, right? But it's not incoherent, right? So the idea is that I can grant that, look, there's mental causal relations, mental to physical causal relations, like in the case of God creating matter, God on your view creating minds, perfectly coherent. Now, why should someone that doesn't believe in God accept that there's, in terms of the entirety of mentality, that God being a mental thing too, a mind, explains my mind, right? Perfectly, I can grant it's coherence. I'm just saying that it seems ad hoc, if you were, at that point to me, because the idea is that you can have a case where my mentality is the explanandum, what needs to be explained, and the explanans, what's the explanation, is something non-mental.
Okay, so fair enough. So this is where I guess we'll try to drill down on some points. So for me, it's difficult because, of course, as an idealist, I do believe everything is mental, right? So when we're talking about mental things versus non-mental things, I'm trying my best to speak that language, obviously giving the caveat of what my view, is ontologically. But of course, because I do believe there are dual aspects of mentality, right? There's like specific consciousness, and then there's, again, all the mental aspects that comprise what we will call the matter of this mug. So I'm trying to speak that language. Even in that context, right, when we talk about causal relations, it's as far as I can tell, based on the presupposition that mentality is still fundamental, right? Because if you didn't have consciousness, there would be no such thing as brain causing mind changes, right? I think, like, if you have, say, a bucket of sand, right, and you draw two eyes and a smiley face in it, did you just cause happiness? Did you just cause that for? Of course not, right? We would recognize that's not the case. And then people want to say, oh, but of course we're not talking about sand. We're looking at a brain. And if you probe certain things in the brain, you can cause happiness, right? They'll speak of those causal relations. The problem is that just what that did is that smuggled in the consciousness, though. That just smuggled in the mind. If we smuggle in a mind or consciousness into a bucket of sand, then sure, maybe we could hypothesize that drawing a smiley face would cause a happy sensation or maybe a sad sensation. We don't know. The point is, when we talk about brain changes causing mentality, that's smuggling in the mind, the consciousness. So I don't know how to get out of this idea that mentality for me is fundamental. Now, when we're talking about the construction problem, obviously you and I are wholeheartedly agreeing on the reductionist view. I am arguing it goes further than that. For those who want to say, well, there's this thing that can get built on top of it, that's what I'm looking for an explanation for. So, for example, when we go to what you brought up in our discussion, where, we can imagine Woody from Toy Story with a mind, and there's nothing necessarily contradictory about that. The question is, though, we need an explanation for that interaction, right? If we started trying to say, well, a certain composite of plastic materials, and then all of a sudden this new thing can be explained via that, the mind, I want to say, no, I don't see any explanation to be found there, because you have the same construction you do with atoms in a brain, right? I agree if there's something more fundamental, like mentality, that can now explain the unity between plastic and mind, or a brain and mind, that's the explanation I'm looking for. So when I posit theism, when you say ad hoc, I'm trying to race in my brain and trying to be careful, because obviously I believe in a cumulative case, right? Obviously there are aspects from other arguments that, inevitably are going to spill into the way I read, certain conclusions from the argument I'm making. But it does seem to me, we have a construction problem. It is even, once we agree on dualism, though, maybe I can drill in this way. On my view, because God is a foundational mentality, he has the resources to build other minds. On a non-mind hypothesis, because obviously I know, for example, you're a Platonist, right? So obviously I'm not going to accuse you of naturalism, but I would, like, what are the resources on your view that could potentially, however you compile, matter or brains or whatever, give rise to mentality? Because I think you appealed to a couple different things, maybe values, having that causal effects. All that, again, to me reads as we're presupposing mind, mentality is foundational there, it's fundamental, and I don't know how to get outside of that.
Okay, so I understand two things that we should talk. Number one, your version of idealism, and number two, what you asked me, what sorts of resources can I appeal to suggest that my my metaphysics can account for mine's.
Mhm.
So the first thing is that the first thing with respect to your view, your idealism, is that idealism is not is a huge. It's not very well. There are different types of idealism. Okay, and I'm an idealist myself, but I'm not the Berkeleyan sense of idealist, right? I think Berkeley was half right. Kant was a kind of idealist who argued against the sort of idealism that Berkeley forwarded, right? Now, it seems like you're a kind of Berkeleyan. That's to say that you think that everything is, and this is what I have to understand. Okay, do you think that all objects are mental?
So again, I haven't studied Berkeley. I'm very uneducated on this, which I know is, maybe I should be more educated if I'm going to speak on it, right? But this is just the conclusions I've reached from reading Rasmussen, from talking to Mike Jones. To me, this is the best view, and I'm going to admit I don't know all the ins and outs. Now, when we talk about, Josh Rasmussen was saying to me, a lot of the latest, scientific evidence is showing that, when you get beyond atoms and quarks, you get down to the most fundamental things that make up matter. It's information. And then information to me is mental. So I think I have to answer yes to your question.
Okay. I forgot my question. So what I asked, if
you asked me if I believe everything was mental.
Whether all objects are mental, and you said yes. Okay. Because to me, okay, there's a couple directions. So like, I'm an idealist. I'll just describe my idealism and I'll compare it to yours, and I'll show you the difference, right?
Okay.
I think that certain qualities that's to say, sort of like experiential states. So when I see color, when I experience depth and length and width and that sorts of stuff, that those are qualities of my mind, and that's that I take that to be a sufficient condition for being an idealist. Okay. Now, there are certain brands of idealism that say that, okay, as far as our metaphysics goes, that's all there is, right? The qualities of the mind. Okay.
Right.
And I'm not that kind of idealist. I'm saying that these sorts of things, like color and those sorts of these experiential states, are in fact mental, that I reject a kind of direct realism. Okay. But there's still something external to my experience and my mentality. Okay.
Yes.
Now, Kant went as far as to say we can't even talk about that stuff, right? And he's hard to interpret. He seems a little inconsistent with it. I'm not gonna give an interpretation of Kant, but the point is that there's that sort of step where, like, these qualities are in the mind, right? But there's still a kind of an external world that is non-mental, right? And that seems to be the kind of idealism that you reject. Okay. And I'm saying that if you accept the former one, I think you're going to fall prey to the same sort of arguments that people give to naturalism, right? Because one of the reasons why I don't accept naturalism is that the first person point of view and the third person point of view are identical, right? Right. The one reduces to the other. I guess the naturalist, the physicalist, wants to say that that what first person things are just really third person things, like atoms and leptons, whatever, right? The Berkeleyan, well, Berkeley's pot is God, but let's just take him out for a second. I know you don't do that, but the idea is that if all there are is just mentality, all objects are mental. All objects are things of the mind. They're mental states. I think it's doing the same problem. It's the same issue, right? It takes all third person things and say that there's actually first person. It's actually a kind of, believe it or not, a kind of reductionism in the opposite direction.
Right.
And someone like me wants to say, well, no, there's this real dichotomy that you can't reduce the first person stuff to the third person, and you can't reduce the third person stuff to the first person. Okay.
Right.
And so, but you see, you can accept that and still be an idealist, which is part of the confusion for me, right? Is that,
yes.
And I understand that if on your view, if you think everything is mental, then that's to say all atoms are mental, and you completely destroy the dichotomy on my view, even if you invoke dual aspect theory. And I think the sorts of arguments that I get to naturalists, I'm going to just give to you. But I see why that on that view, right, then of course, what's going to be fundamental is a mind. And I'm certainly not a fundamental entity. I'm a contingent entity, right? And if we're talking about kind of ultimate foundation of reality, of the actual world, if it's going to be mental, then, well, why not call that God, right? And I do accept that argument, bracketing my previous concerns, right? That if you could substantiate your version of idealism, where all objects are mental, and that all human beings, right, all organisms themselves are finite creatures, contingent creatures, right? Then there's something more fundamental to them than say, and that's mental. Well, then that's what we were going to call God. That's kind of what Berkeley did. Kind of what he did. The issue for me is that I just don't accept that kind of idealism, given given it, I take it to be a reductionistic account.
Mm-hmm. So maybe just some clarification. So I want to agree with you can't reduce one to the other. And this is why, admittedly, I don't even like the term idealism, because I feel like there's certain baggage that gets carried in with it that I don't subscribe to. And obviously, as people can see in this conversation, even using the term dual aspect idealism doesn't seem to be enough of a clarification to do it. So this is third person information. Even if I want to say that that's reduced to mentality, it's not reduced to my mentality, right? I'm not that kind of idealist. I'm not the kind of idealist where when I leave the room, all of the things in this room disappear and cease to exist, right?
But I think it's not third person. It's actually first person, but it's just not of your first person. It's of some other first person, right? So in what sense would it be third person if it's actually God's first person point of view?
Well, so this is where I might be getting to the limits of my ability to properly, what would you say, explain my views here, because again, God is thinking and again, it's hard for me to do this because again, the analogy is an imperfect one, right? We think on a private canvas. The theory is that God thinks on a public canvas, right? But so obviously the shapes in my mind, they're mental, right? But we wouldn't say they're identical with, for example, like my qualia or these kinds of things. Like I'm still kind of creating them and bringing them into being via my things, and that's what I'm arguing God is doing, right? So it's not identical with, say, God's what would you say, his power to choose or his qualia, but I would say they fundamentally are mental. But I still want to say they're the third person. They're not so third person, again, that they kind of are separate from God. They're certainly third person to us, and I don't know if that helps.
Well, just think about if a naturalist did the opposite, right? That, oh well, the brain is first person, but it's actually these third person objects like leptons, electrons, synapses, and neurons, right? And I just wouldn't accept that, right? Because I think that, once again, that's just saying that they're telling. Go ahead.
No, the reason you wouldn't accept it is the same reason I wouldn't accept it. We know minds exist, right? The very question is, what is this? Is this matter, a separate substance, or is this fundamentally mental? That's the question we're trying to answer.
But we're not clear on what you're saying it is. Are you saying the mug or the qualities in your mind of the mug? That's to say, your experiences of it. Those are two different things on my view, right? On Berkeley's view, right? It was all experience. The mug is just experiences. And what it meant for the mug to exist is to say that it is, in fact, an experience. Okay? But on my view and on Kant's view, right, it's that there's an experience of the mug, but it's an experience of something else, right? So there's a kind of duality, right? That there's the mug and there's the qualities in your mind, the mental states that are of the mug. So when you're looking at the mug, when I'm looking at the mug on my screen, those are just qualities. I don't have this direct access to the mug in itself. And the
that's definitely true.
Right. And then you want to say that what the mug is in itself is something that's understandable in terms of God's mental states, right? And so
fundamentally, yes, it's information that he created.
Right, but you see, if it's God's mental states, then there is no third person.
Even if we go with that, and by the way, I'll thank you. I'm not going to press this to the point where I'm arguing something just for the sake of proving my point when I don't even know what my point is anymore. Admittedly, I'm going to think about this more, right?
This is just very difficult philosophy here. This is like
sure.
Very, very difficult. I mean, it's something that I'm interviewing, and if anybody interested, you should watch this definitely. I'm interviewing an idealist tomorrow at 8 a.m. You can just watch the recording if that's too early. Dr. Bernardo Castro. He's an idealist of your kind.
Okay, cool.
He's not a Kantian idealist, a transcendental idealist, right? So he supports your view. Very, very intelligent, far more educated than I am, and I'm just going to be asking him these sorts of questions, so and see how he responds. But yeah. Anyways, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt, but the point is that it's a hard issue.
Yes, and again, the reason I take this view is because despite what you're raising, I just see more problems with alternative views. So that's kind of where I find myself right now. But I would say this, even when I get back to this point where it's like I don't know exactly how I would answer, right? I still have to say, well, okay, but what's the most reasonable view? And the point is we know, again, that this is reducible to information, right? It does go beyond atoms. Right. Josh Mason. When we go beyond atoms, beyond quarks, information is what seems to be most fundamental, even to matter. Right.
Ooh, if you ever Google SEP, the word information, have you ever if you go on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and Google information or search information, you're not going to get a straight answer. It's an ambiguous. Sure. It's a vague term.
Fair enough.
So what I take that to mean is that it's a quality of your mind, okay? That what your experiences of what you're seeing, right? There's a phenomenology of the cup, and that's mental, right? That's your experience of it. Its depth, its color, it's the way it appears, right? It's all mental, and that's how I interpret you there.
Yeah, again, but I think that there's information that's at least third person to me, right? And by the way, I think you could, again, I'm not prone to do it right now, but I think one could make an argument for God's mind from there to say, well, this is clearly information that's independent of us, but it's clearly still mental, and obviously that would have to be in something like an omniscient mind that can hold reality together and then allow our minds to interact with it. The point I'm making is, even where the problems might lie in that, there is at least a sense that you and I can agree that this there's a lot that has to do with this that is reliant on our mentality, right? Whereas the opposite view, I don't think you can make as clear an argument that there's a lot of our mentality that just relies on some kind of substance of matter. Again, and I think describing things like, well, clearly our minds interact with our brains and our bodies, again, I think that kind of just presupposes mentality to such a high extent that mentality still has to be fundamental there. And so I'm saying, even the problems on my view, I just don't see it as equal. I see far more problems in trying to explain all of mentality in terms of third person matter.
Yeah, it would take some time to understand you. But I think that I've heard someone characterize how do you come to a philosophical view, or how do you come to accept a particular conclusion? And it's not, sometimes people think of philosophy in this way, that you accept the views with the least amount of problems, right? Because every view has problems, right? You're theism, atheism, they all have problems. The one you pick is which one has the least number of problems, right? So I think that's kind of the angle you're getting from here is like, look, okay, there might be some questions I can't answer about my sense of my view of idealism, but I know that what you've got and what other people have got have more problems, and so I'm just committed to this view. Mm-hmm. I understand that. I'm just trying to understand the view, because you want to say there are third person, there are objects in the third person, right, in the third person perspective. Mm-hmm. But then I see that ultimately that is reduced to God's mind, right? Because since he's the foundation of reality in some sense, like at least that's what Berkeley thought. And to me, that's just as problematic as when a naturalist says, oh yeah, there's a bunch of first person things, but ultimately there's just atoms, and first person things go to, are just these atoms. I think it's just a problem in reverse. Although I prefer. I have to say, your view is far more sexy than naturalism.
Well,
Yeah,
so that's what I was about to say. I share your desire to maintain a distinction between third person and first person. What I think we'd fundamentally disagree is I think if we have to reduce one to the other, I'm going to be way more comfortable reducing third person stuff to first person stuff than I am reducing first person stuff to third person stuff. I think the former is at least potentially possible, where I don't think the latter is even possible.
Well, let me agree with you there. My intuitions lean with your sense of idealism over naturalism. But I think that if I'm trying to take my intuitions out of the picture, I think that they're equally philosophically problematic.
Okay.
But my intuitions are with you, though. My intuitions are with you.
Yeah, and perhaps it's a terrible flaw on myself to have focused so hard in here on idealism, because I think for the purposes that were kind of our original intention here was to discuss an argument for mind for God. I think dualism.
No, this is completely on point, right? Because Berkeley's argument for why God exists is your argument. Okay, believe it. So Berkeley was basically say, hey, what it means to exist is for a thing to be perceived or to be experienced, right? So when I say the computer screen exists in front of me is just to say I'm having an experience of the computer screen. Mm-hmm. And Berkeley said, well, but what happens if there's no perceiver, right? If no one's looking at the forest, does the forest no longer exist? Well, then he posits God, right? And the idea that Berkeley was half right? That the idea is that what is going on when I'm seeing the computer is not some kind of direct realism, right? That what I'm having is a kind of indirect internal mentality of the computer screen. Okay, he thought that color and size, length, width, all these things are qualities of the mind. So there is a sense in which mentality is foundational to ourselves, right? So then he just kind of took that and ran with it, and with respect to the whole reality, and say, well, then God accounts for the whole of reality. And this was an argument for the existence of God, right? And it was one that was taken very seriously up until Kant butchered it. And but no, I mean, it was one of the first arguments I ever heard for God was Berkeley's in a classroom was Berkeley's argument for the existence of God, and I was moved by it, right? And immediately I accepted idealism. But I just didn't. I just kind of then sympathize with like some of the Kant had. So no,
no, fair enough. Maybe I could drill down on 2 points then. And I just lost the second one. But hopefully I'll be reminded of it as remind myself of it as I'm going through the first one. So the first one is, again, I think my argument can still work on dualism, right? Because again, we're saying, well, there's these dual things, there's matter and there's mind. We know there's mind. Here's the argument for mind. And then here's why that can't be explained in terms of matter. Therefore, it has to be explained in terms of a foundational mentality. And even if we posit something like a reverse problem, well, then how does God create matter? Well, one, I would say, well, that's almost inconsequential to the argument, because we're asking how to construct minds, right? How to construct matter is an important thing, but it's kind of secondary to the question we're asking. We're asking how do we construct minds? You can't do it with matter. You have to do it in terms of foundational mentality. But then insofar as there is... Go ahead.
I don't... If God created minds, he doesn't construct them. I think that's misleading, given how Rasmussen uses construction, right? It's not like God... I don't think this makes no sense on my view. It's not like God took the building blocks and put them in an arrangement to where, wow, you get mind. Okay. I think it's actually as intimate as A to B, not in terms of like God taking all these parts and then putting them together to make mind. It's just there's God's intention and then there's suddenly mind, and there's not going to be a further explanation for it, right? So, and then I'm sorry, there's a fly, and it's really bothering me. But the point is that there's not. You're probably commonly asked by atheists, if maybe you're not, what is the mechanism in which God created? And I think that's a nonsense question. Okay, because
the way
that
I think we talked about the debate, the direct A to B. But yeah, go. I'm sorry, continue.
Because you're going to get an infinite regress, right? Then you have a mechanism, and then
And then
so
mechanism to explain the interaction with the mechanism. Yeah.
right. So the idea is just very simple, right? There was God's desire, and then a material state followed, right?
Sure.
That's just with us too, I think, right? When I desire water, and I make a choice, rather an action. Okay, there's a mental state followed by an immediate material state. Okay, and so there's no further thing in between. Okay,
Yeah.
so and that's the way that if matter brought about minds, that's it got to work the same way, right? In the sense that there's no extra mechanism of like matter, or there's no like set of sufficient conditions that can be under the umbrella of a unified theory of mind. Did you want to say something?
So I think it's hard. So for example, if we're talking about this kind of one-to-one God not taking these pre-existing building blocks, fair enough. So obviously when we talk about building blocks in terms of God creating mentality, it's something different. But where I think the analogy is helpful is, let's say you have a house, and let's just radically simplify the house to saying the only three components that comprise it are brick, wood, and window, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever the explanation we're looking for as far as building blocks, you have to have bricks, wood, and window, right? You can't just have bricks and wood and then expect to get a house with windows, right? Or you can't just have glass and wood and then expect to get a house with bricks, right? So the point of when we're talking about God constructing minds is we're saying, okay, yeah, fair enough. There's this one-to-one, this direct causality, but again, God has all the components, so to speak. He has the qualia, he has the direct access, he has the power to choose, and so he can construct the minds in as opposed to God, let's say, not having qualia, but then constructing creatures that have qualia. That would, I think, run into some foul play. And then you said, well, on the terms of if matter explains, it has to be similar. I don't think so, right? Because stones, rocks don't have any of the first-person experiences. Atoms don't have any of the first-person experiences. Skin, the brain, the gray matter in my brain doesn't have any of the first person experiences. So it seems as though if we're going to say, well, hold on, but if for some reason in organic life forms there are these experiences, it seems that at somewhere along the lines we're talking in terms of explanation of the combination of the properties.
Okay, I didn't follow your last point. I'm just saying that if it's the case that a physical state caused a mental state, there's not going to be a further mechanism for how that happened. That's all I meant.
Oh, right? Okay. So I misunderstood you there. Okay, that's my bad then.
Yeah, no, it's not like I said, not easy stuff, and I could do better in communicating. But the point is that to ask like, what is the mechanism for how minds came about, or were the effect of a physical state? There's not. My view is that there can't be a mechanism. And so but I really, truthfully, I don't know if that's even true that minds were the effect of a material state. I'm just saying that it's possible in the first case, because I do think that there are non-physical, non-mental entities in the world as well. Okay, but I really don't have any good example other than value properties, right? But I'm just saying that there could be non-mental phenomena that are external to minds that could explain why they're minds. But that's just a way of saying that there's possibilities, right? And so just to say that God is a possible explanation, we need to do the work to show why God is the best explanation rather than And I think that your avenue through idealism is one such. If your argument for idealism worked, your explanation would not be ad hoc. Okay, I think that my charge that you're giving an ad hoc explanation would be unfounded, given the fact that you think that, oh well, here my argument is that it seems like everything is mental, given Berkeley's considerations, for instance. And so, if that's true, then minds came from minds, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to be so quick to say it's ad hoc. I'm just going to dispute the argument for idealism.
Yeah. So I don't think it's ad hoc. Obviously, I mean, because I think there are independent arguments for why you need a foundation, right? And then I think if you have a cumulative case for other arguments that lead to a similar kind of foundation, that it's not really ad hoc to say the same one. No, yeah, fair enough. I just, for the audience, it's like I feel the need to kind of make my case here. And another reason I want to say it's not ad hoc is because when you say, well, even something ad hoc can be logically possible, right? Well, I want to say, well, mine is logically possible, and I don't think the alternative is logically impossible or is logically possible. And if that's true, then we're left with my explanation, which then is an ad hoc to
Right. Yeah, that
accept
makes
it.
sense. That makes sense to me. I still don't really understand why on my view it's impossible.
Well, so it's tough now because at this point I don't know if I could say anything radically new that I haven't said, except one thing did just occur to me as you were talking about what was it that I'm out of place for asking for a mechanism for how the brain
Yeah, I
interacts
don't think there
with
can be a
consciousness.
mechanism.
Right.
I mean, there can be an explanation. Okay, so I don't take mechanisms and explanations to be synonymous terms. I think all mechanisms are explanations, but not all explanations are mechanism.
That is certainly fair.
Right. I don't think God is a mechanism. Okay.
Right.
I don't think I'm a mechanism, right? In the sense, like, what's the mechanism for why I don't know why there's a Honda Accords, right? To say that, oh well, it's the mechanism is the CEO of Honda. That just seems so weird, right? The idea is that a mechanism is something that you postulate that's consistent of perhaps part whole relations that is governed perhaps by laws, right? And so I just don't think that kind of thing could account for minds at all, right?
Yeah.
I don't think minds can be mechanisms either, right? So on either view, I accept that God is not going to be a mechanism. And I don't think that if it's the case that something explains the mind and it's non-mental, that itself is not going to be a mechanism. It's going to be some kind of maybe brute contingent explanation that's not governed by laws, right?
Well, no, fair enough. However, I would say there needs to be a mechanism, even if it's not physical. And let me justify my assertion there. On the one hand, so there's two ways of speaking about this, and I bring the second one in just because I think it might be relevant. You can also speak of a context, right? So I did a devil's advocate with Eric Hernandez where I played the atheist. And basically I said, well, you have a problem because you have a mind interacting with a brain. What's the context in which that makes that interaction possible? And he rebutted me with what you said. He said, well, no, because then you just get into an infinite regress of contexts needed for the soul to then interact with the context and this and that, right? So there's that. So I want to say, for example, I don't think God is a mechanism, right? I do think his mentality serves as a unifying context in which our minds can interact with what we're calling our brains, whether we want to reduce that to mentality or not, right? Because again, God is the creator and sustainer of all of it, all of matter and mind can serve as the unifying context in which there is that interaction. Mm-hmm. Now, when we get to we say, okay, there's brain causing minds, right? The reason I do think that requires either a third mechanism or context is precisely because what's found in the matter is insufficient to have a one-on-one direct explanation of the consciousness. This is why in our debate I gave the example of a cartoon causing sounds. We recognize, well, the pixels on the screen are insufficient to cause sounds coming out of the characters' mouths, right? So you do need something more, a context or a mechanism that's going on behind the scenes. It's kind of like the analogy Josh gave with if you see water springing from a rock. You realize that the materials of the rock are insufficient to explain the water coming forth, and so you need something more to explain it. And my argument is that is analogous to minds coming from brains. Is the brains and the matter is insufficient to explain the minds, and so there has to be something more that's explaining that connection.
Do you think that a brain state can cause a mental state?
It's funny. Before I spoke with Josh on the phone the other day, I would have said yes. But even if you say yes, that presupposes the mental state.
Well, given your idealism, right? But look, is it that you think
not even given idealism.
Wait, are brain states mental?
I want to say yes, but I also want to try to make this argument compatible with dualism. So it's tough for me. Let's just say even on dualism, let's say you had somebody that I'm just a lifeless corpse. Brain changes aren't going to do anything, right? Stabbing my brain isn't going to do anything. Putting a spike through it, messing with the nodes, that doesn't do anything. It's only when you have consciousness or mentality already there that you can even speak of brain causing mental changes. And so the mentality still seems to be fundamental to me there.
You think that's a necessary truth?
It seems to me a necessary condition.
Okay.
I mean, again, I'm open to an argument to prove me wrong there, but that seems right to me.
Well, you're saying something that if there's necessarily, right, for a brain state to cause a mental state, there must be a mind already, and right. That seems like what you're.
Yeah,
what
of course.
Right. Okay. So I think that the idea of there being a mental state implies a mind necessarily, right? But all I'm saying is that that if it's possible that a state can be caused by a non-mental state, right? And I was going to apply whether that needed a mechanism, right? So
It depends. I think it needs a context. But again, if we already have, let's say, a kind of reality that you and I would as closely agree on as possible, right? Where we have these dual aspects, whatever we ultimately classify them as, and you already have a mind interacting with a brain, then of course it makes sense that when you talk about a one-to-one correlation from the brain to the mind, yes, but that's already seated inside the context. Whereas on the alternative hypothesis, I don't see that context.
Right? I don't see why that matters. The point is that, okay, there's a mind already. Okay. I'm just saying that we have a case in which a non-mental disposition, like a brain state, brings about a mental state. And I'm just asking, do we need does that require a mechanism?
It requires a context in which the two can interact, certainly.
But it doesn't require a mechanism.
I would say no, it doesn't require a mechanism. But again, it presupposes the consciousness.
Sure. But the point is that there's an example of a non-mental state interacting causally with a mental state in a way where you don't need to postulate a mechanism, right? Because nothing about the phrase... Go ahead.
So the only reason you don't need to posit the mechanism is because, again, you already have the two existing within the context. If you didn't even have the context, then I wouldn't say that.
Can you help me understand what that means in the context? I interpret you initially as there's already a mind. Okay.
So either I'm trying to make this argument compatible with both the dualist and the idealist, right? On the idealist, we would say the brain is emergent of the mind, and right. So that's precisely the context we're talking of, right? And so in that's the kind of one context. On a dualism account, I'd want to say prefer the context sort of as God as the unifying reality that unifies matter and mind. Right. Whereas if you take God out of that, how can you even speak of the two interacting?
How? I mean, look. Okay, is it just with this phrase alone? Is there a contradiction? Okay, in a world where some physical state causes a mental state. That's all. That's all. Is that coherent on your view? And you don't know anything else. You just know that there are those terms. Is there anything incoherent about that?
It's I promise I'm not trying to be squirrely here. When you say I don't know anything else, that makes it trouble for me. Because for me, I want to say no, it's not incoherent, but it's only not incoherent because I have certain presuppositions that go into it. But if you're kind of saying, well, I can't have those presuppositions going into it, I don't know if I want to say it's coherent.
No, that's not squirrely. I mean, if the question just seems unintelligible to you, if I kind of isolate the proposition, that's how I'm reading you right now, right? That you don't know what it would mean to say that a physical state causes a mental state independent of any kind of context, right?
Now, of course, I mean, do I have to say we have direct experience of that happening? Of course.
Right, and the idea is that I think most people find it perfectly coherent to say, and even people in our camp, dualist and idealist, there's a sense in which, this physical thing, I hit you with a baseball bat, and that led you to the belief that you got hit by a baseball bat, right? There's a physical state causing you to have some belief state, okay?
Yes.
And I'm saying that that's coherent, independent of your views of idealism.
So now we're likely to go down a rabbit trail that I don't know. So tell me if I'm just going completely off on the wrong course and you want to steer us back to where we're going, right? Because I'm not sure I agree with that statement. So there was a debate, I don't know if you saw this a while ago, Frank Turek had with Jeffrey Lauder which I really enjoyed. And Frank Turek made his argument that on naturalism has such a thing as free will. We have free will. Theism better explains it. Yada yada yada. And Jeffrey Lauder comes in and says, "Well, hold on, no, because we have free will, and that's logically coherent, independent of our ontology." And he gave an example to say we have eyes. Our eyes work, and they work regardless of our ontology. And to me, I want to say no, I don't agree, because suppose one posits an ontology that would say necessitate that what the eye actually does is it pictures all these illusions because that helps us survive better in the evolutionary process. In that case, the ontology would certainly affect the coherency of you just trying to talk about eyes working. And so to me, that's kind of what I'm bringing here. If you say, well, of course we have these brain states causing mental states, that's independent of anything else. To me, I want to say, no, I don't think it's independent of anything else, because I think, again, at least on a naturalist perspective, which we'd both be against, I don't see the two interacting.
Yeah. So what if I were to ask a naturalist, like, does it make sense to say a physical state interacts with a mental state? And if I was to try to use that as an argument against naturalism, it would fail. Why? Because they just take a mental state to be a kind of physical state, right, not just a general physical state. But the point is that it's still coherent to them, right? They could be wrong about all their ontology, right? The thing is that it makes sense, even regardless of the incoherence of naturalism, when I say that a physical state interacts with a mental state, because what they take that to mean is that the mental state is going to be one kind of physical state, the kind of physical state in which is contrasted from any kind of non-mental physical state, right? And I'm just saying that it might make sense to you in that way, right? But then if I were to translate this to an ideal, if you're going to assume idealism, the idealist would just understand it the opposite way, right? And this goes back to my objection that I had given earlier, right? When I say that, is it coherent, Stellman, to have some kind of physical state cause you to have some kind of mental state? That should be totally coherent, because the way you're going to understand that is that this physical state is going to be a kind of mental state that's different from a particular kind of your internal mental state, right? Okay, and then we go into my objection about the distinction between first person and third person, which I take to be a serious distinction, right? So it's sort of a pincer, in other words, right? Either if that's coherent to you and you want to preserve idealism, then you've got to come up with a response between of the reductive account that I think the idealist is giving when they're saying that all third person points of view things or objects are just subjective mental states, right? And I'm saying, well, that destroys the distinction, and then we have that conversation. Or it makes sense to you in some other way where it conforms to my view, right? Where it's perfectly coherent to have a kind of ontological category, the physical state, causing a totally different kind of ontological category, my internal mental state. Okay, I think that's how I understand the dialect.
Yeah. I mean, I think at the very least, on my view, when we talk about the reductionist, at least this is third person to my mentality, right? That solves, I think, substantively more issues than I can think at the moment, right? I think the problem is for you is, can we reduce that to God's first person mentality? And so I think that's the question we need to answer. But so long as there's a distinction between my mentality and the outside world, we can still coherently speak of an interaction there, right? And then we just have to get into the bits of what is that interaction. But then on the dualist account, right, I still think you have a unifying context in which the mental and the physical can interact. The very problem is, of course your statement is coherent, right? But again, to me, it's coherent precisely because we're speaking of mentality. We're speaking of, you already have a situation in which minds and brains are interacting. And then so when you ask, is it coherent for the brain to have these causal impacts? It's like, of course, because the two interact. Of course, that's coherent. My precise objection is, I don't think we should expect that coherency on some sort of naturalism or non-mind hypothesis.
Yeah, and I guess like the conversation to me in terms of I mean it I don't know. I mean, I'm fine with talking, but it isn't. It's been an hour and 30 minutes. But the idea is that The objections that I would give is that first person, third person distinction, and also the distinction between normative and non-normative. The idea is that I take intentionality to be normative, and I take non-intentionality to be non-normative, right? So if you're going to collapse one into the other, I think you're bridging the Azad gap. So what the physicalist does, in other words, is they understand all these brain states, which are all descriptive, not prescriptive, and they want to say that all of that is just prescriptive stuff, and that there's a contradiction on my view there. But what the idealist is saying, with respect to intentionality, at least, let's bracket qualia, okay? What the idealist is saying is that there is nothing non-normative, right? Everything is normative with respect to the reality. But I think that if everything's normative, then you just don't have, there's not a way the world is, right? There's just the way the world is construed or ought be.
No, and then it's difficult for me because when you start talking about audits, I start immediately thinking about morality, and obviously that's not where you're going. So you're right. I didn't actually realize how much time was going past. So would you like to add? I would like to give you the last word here. So is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No. I really enjoyed having a discussion with you. I've said this like 3 times. This is not easy philosophy. I'm
happy I could at least partially keep up.
Yeah, this is the debate we were having is sort of related to the realism, anti-realism debate about, our internal states versus the world, the external world. It's a very difficult dialectic. In fact, it's so confusing that I'm starting to adopt different views about it. I think that there's in case you didn't know, there's a category of philosophers that just kind of find the whole discussion unsubstantive. And they might take pragmatic theories of truth. And they think that, truth is a function of, or truth is something like the goal of inquiry. So whatever is out there, is going to be kind of understood in a pragmatic way. And so as if to dodge the whole dialectic. I'm starting, because that's how confusing it is, to a point where, like, okay, well, it looks like this epistemic pragmatism is becoming a little bit more enticing, right? Because it's difficult, right? It seems like we're constrained by our internal states. So how in the world do we have knowledge of something outside of our internal states? And the idealists, the naturalists, the dualists, they all have different answers to these, and they all sound, semi-intelligible, and it's hard to keep up with, but I appreciate you talking to me about it.
Of course. And one of the things we never got to talk about, though, which maybe I can have you back on it if you want to talk about disembodied minds, because I anticipated that coming up in the debate, and I did a lot of study on it, and then it didn't come up, and I was like, it was still good for me to have the knowledge, but
I think that I would have to just say that I think that ends up becoming arguments against the existence of God, essentially, because I just take God to be disembodied. Like, that's what makes him God, in my view. If he's embodied, then if he's essentially embodied, then I just don't. You're just talking about Zeus or something.
Sure.
But yeah. Anyways, thanks for your time.
Not to get into that. Obviously, we'll just save that for the next episode. I think disembodied mind can be defended, but then Josh Rasmussen had an interesting thought on, if you're a Platonist, there's kind of a way to talk about maybe a God embodied in the universe on something. So definitely that'll give us some stuff to think about for the next episode. So yeah, until then, I really do appreciate you coming on, talking with me. Again, for people who are out there, if you are new to the channel, please subscribe, hit notification bells, and go over to Danny's channel, Phil Talk. It's linked in the description. Subscribe to his channel. And until next time, thank you, Danny, so much for being here, brother, and I hope to do it again soon.
Thanks for having me.